Hello and welcome to the webinar today. We are excited to have you here as part of the Pathwalk Innovation Series. Our session today is with Michael Rasmussen from GRC 2020 Research and titled GRC 6.0 Business Integrated GRC Embedding Controls Across Business Systems and Applications. He will introduce himself in just a moment.
Hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here today and work with everybody virtually on this very important topic of GRC 6.0, Business Integrated GRC. I'm Michael Rasmussen, the GRC analyst and pundit. I've got 30 years total of experience, but 23 of those as an analyst. The way I describe my job is I help I research. I'm a researcher, being an analyst, and I research what are the challenges companies face in the context of governance, risk, and compliance, and how do they go about solving those challenges with strategy, process, and technology. I guess my claim to fame is that in February 2002, 21 years ago, on a cold, snowy day in the Chicago office of Forrester Research, I defined and modeled a market for technology like what Pathwalk sits in and labeled it GRC. So I've been called the father of GRC, being the first to leverage and use that acronym. Let's get into this. GRC 6.0 Business Integrated GRC. So in this context, organizations are about what I call navigating chaos. In fact, I wrote a paper on this for the Institute of Risk Management in their Enterprise Risk magazine in London a few years back. But if you think about it, regulations are changing minute by minute, second by second, not just regulations, but also laws, enforcement actions, and all that. At the same time, there's a very complex external risk environment, geopolitical risks, risks of inflation and uncertainty and economic uncertainty with that, to supply chain disruptions and so much more. But then the business itself is changing. Employees come in, they change roles, you have inherited rights issues and so forth. They exit the organization and rights aren't terminated. Technology changes, it's not configured properly. We have issues of shifts in strategy, then mergers and acquisitions that bring completely redundant systems and processes in. The modern organization is navigating chaos, and keeping risk and controls in sync is quite a challenge. Because we have to keep up with all this change, the legal and regulatory change, the change in the external risk environment, which might mean to heighten exposure to things like fraud and bribery and corruption and other uncertainty, to a changing business environment through shifts in employees, shifts in mergers and acquisitions that bring in redundant sets of controls and ERP systems and processes. That is a lot. The modern organization has to keep in sync all of this very complex, evolving change upon the organization, and that's navigating chaos. The physicist Friedrich Capra stated, "The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent." The physicist at the time of this particular quote was talking about biological ecosystems, but he might as well have been talking about risk in the modern business environment. Go back a few years and take COVID-19 as an example. What starts off with the health and safety risk brings in IT security risks in the work from home environment, privacy in the work from home environment, to increase risk of fraud, increase risk of bribery and corruption as ports were and customs was backed up and closed. There's greater risk that somebody might bribe a foreign government official to expedite their goods through customs, and so much more. It is an interconnected risk environment. And we have to keep all this risk in sync, and those little things matter. We have to pay attention to them. Leonardo da Vinci said, "Realize that everything connects to everything else." Because in this world of navigating chaos of business today, it's the whole idea of chaos theory plays into effect, where the theory that the flutter of the butterfly's wings in the Netherlands makes tiny atmospheric changes that can influence the development path of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. It's those little things that matter, that inherited rights issue, that control that wasn't in place or wasn't properly configured. There's so much that's happening out there that can expose the organization, and we have to keep up on this. Some of the challenges that I see in internal control management is trying to manage multiple lines of business, particularly in a large distributed organization. We have the proliferation of business applications, and many of them to the cloud and cloud environments, and ERP and CRM and so much more, and procurement systems and so forth. This enters a web of access to all these systems and transactions with a complex trail to be able to see what's happening across different systems, not just within a specific system. Then mergers and acquisitions bring in the completely redundant sets of ERP systems and controls and risks and things, and some of those go on indefinitely. I remember a healthcare organization that consolidated over, 20 years, nearly 30 hospitals, and ended up with 18,000 policy and procedure documents. And I don't even know how many controls come out of that. Mergers and acquisitions add to this chaos, especially if there isn't consolidation and things and standardization on these areas. But then you have issues of isolated systems that monitor controls from a single application's perspective. There's a lot of technology out there that can just monitor like SAP access controls and things like that, but they can't see across access across the different types of systems. Maybe you're a heterogeneous environment. You've got SAP, you've got Oracle, you've got Salesforce, and who knows what else, Coupa and things. But all of a sudden, you can only see islands of control, but not control across these different systems in what today is complex and distributed processes in the modern organization. Then you have the challenge of migrating things to the cloud, and how do we deal with this? And we have shadow IT or parts of the organization bypassing IT altogether and purchasing software solutions in the cloud and implementing business processes on there with little or no control out there and putting the organization at significant exposure. And then we have increase in access and transaction volume and velocity and dealing with the wide range of different access given to individuals, inherited rights issues, and so much more. How do we deal with that? Well, if you're dealing with this with documents, spreadsheets, and emails, that is certainly the inevitability of failure. You can't keep up. You're always behind the game. And I've seen organization after organization, like one organization I talked to did an internal study of their risk compliance, internal control, and audit resources, found out that 80% of their staff time was trying to manage and chase documents and emails and not manage controls and risk. Another firm I was talking to was trying to build a report for the board of directors. It took them 200 hours to build, and they had to go through all these different documents, spreadsheets, and emails and aggregate and tabulate and build this report to find out that they had risk and control issues that started 11 months ago that were out of control now. That's not managing risk. That's reacting to risk at that point. We need effective approaches to be able to manage controls in a GRC context across complex business systems and processes in a heterogeneous environment. Now, some of you might have isolated systems and struggle with document spreadsheets and emails. We need a strong internal control management architecture that can manage the range of internal controls across the business. If you want an enterprise view of risk, it mandates, I would say necessitates, an enterprise view of controls as well. When you have a risk, what can you do with the risk? There's 4 things you can do with the risk. You can accept the risk as it is. You can avoid the risk by making a decision where there's no longer a risk, if that's an option. You can transfer the risk, like through hedging and insurance and derivatives and things like that. But the one we often focus on the most is we mitigate the risk. How do you mitigate the risk? Well, you implement controls. You have your inherent risk here, and we decide we need to implement control A, B, and C, and here's our residual risk that we find acceptable. And so if you're going to have an enterprise view of risks and you're going to take on risk mitigation exercise, it necessitates that organizations also have an enterprise view of controls and be able to manage those controls in the organization to ensure that risk is being mitigated and managed to an acceptable level. So today's organization needs to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, that individual control and risk as well as the interconnectedness of risk controls across systems. The tree and the forest is a good analogy, but I teach my enterprise GRC management by design workshops around the world, as well as policy management and third-party risk and internal control management. I've been challenged on this slide twice, a week apart, once in San Francisco and once in London. Same workshop, different companies said the same thing. They said, good analogy, the tree and the forest, but the reality is in our organization, it's more than the tree and the forest. It's also the leaves and the branches. That we need to get down to the details. It could be that control and risk, but what about all the transactions and access and everything else that pulls into that as well? We have to get very granular visibility into different systems, into transactions, into access to be able to protect the organization. So the tree and the forest is a great analogy, but we cannot forget about the leaves and the branches. It's absolutely critical. It's necessary in today's organization. So let's define GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance. It's been around for 21 years and some months because I first defined and used the acronym in February 2002. I helped contribute to the definition that's found in the OSEG GRC capability model, the only vetted standard for governance, risk, and compliance that's publicly available. There's lots of standards and frameworks out there for risk management, lots for compliance, lots for internal control, but the OSEG GRC capability model is the only one that's vetted for the breadth of governance, risk, and compliance. And in that model, we define GRC as a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives. That's the governance function. Those objectives can be entity level objectives, division, department, process level objectives like accounts receivable, accounts payable, procurement processes, payroll processes, to project, to relationship, like third-party suppliers and so forth, to actual asset level objectives like EU citizen information and things like that that might have GDPR related objectives to it. So we have those objectives. Then we have to address uncertainty, which is risk. The ISO 31000 International Standard on Risk Management defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So there's a relationship between the R and the G. And act with integrity, that's the compliance, where we and not only act with integrity to the laws and regulation, but to the values, the ethics, the ESG statements and commitments of the organization. All this is absolutely critical. So GRC is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve objectives, address uncertainty, and act with integrity. So the governance part of it sets the direction and strategy for the organization to reliably achieve objectives. Governance sets the context for risk management. Without context, risk management fails. You don't just wake up one day and say, I feel like doing a risk assessment and spin the wheel. What am I going to assess the risk of? No, we have to have context. The objectives of the organization sets that context that we can then do a risk assessment in. So risk management seeks to manage and understand uncertainty through the identification, assessment, and monitoring of risk within the context to act on risk. And we act on risk through risk acceptance, risk avoidance, risk transfer like insurance and hedging, and risk mitigation through implementation of controls. But if I do that risk assessment and I have a mitigation strategy of implementing control A, B, and C, who says that those controls are ever actually implemented and ever actually operational and effective? Risk management is completely dependent on compliance and control functions to make sure that the controls that were identified in that risk assessment that are needed to mitigate that risk to an acceptable level are actually implemented and operational in the organization. So compliance aims to see that the organization acts with integrity in fulfilling its regulatory, contractual, and self-imposed obligations and values. Compliance follows through on risk treatment plans to assure that risk is being managed within limits and controls are in place and functioning. So let's look at 5 strategic trends in GRC that I'm seeing in 2023. Those 5 trends are agility, resilience, integrity, accountability, and engagement. Now, you'd like to think I'm going to start with agility, but no, I'm going to start with resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover from a risk event and get back in the game and to be able to learn from our issues so we don't have repeated issues. If I'm running down the street or the trail and I trip over an obstacle, resilience is how quickly can I get back up and start running again? How quickly can I recover and hopefully not have a repeated issue? That's resilience. And the last several years have shown that we need resilient organizations that can find control issues, contain them, and recover from them quickly before there's too much damage and exposure to the organization. We need to be resilient. COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, economic uncertainty, and supply chain disruptions, all this has shown that we need resilient organizations. In fact, I'm interacting with a large global hospitality chain out there. And based on some of my publications this year on resilience, they're actually rebranding their risk department to be risk and resilience. In the testing they've done with the line of business, from executives down to operational managers, they find that the business actually understands and owns resilience in a way that they do not own and understand risk. Who wants to be accountable for risk? They throw risk around like a hot potato. You be accountable for this, not me. But what business manager, what executive doesn't want to be resilient? They all do, particularly after the last several years. So they're finding that the business is warming up to the idea of resilience more than the idea of risk, even though both go hand in hand. But we need to be resilient. But the other one, that number one, is the agility. So I started number two in the trends, resilience, but now organizations are saying, how do we move beyond resilience? How do we become agile to be able to navigate our environment? You remember I used that analogy. If I'm running down the street of the trail and I trip over an obstacle, resilience is how quickly can I get back up and start running again. Agility is to be able to see what's coming at me and to leap over that obstacle or go around it so I don't trip. Now, organizations are looking for risk agility. What's coming at me? What's coming up on the horizon 6 months from now, 9 months from now, a year from now? How can different scenarios of economic uncertainty and geopolitical risk and all this and operational risks play out? How can it unfold? How can I best prepare the organization and address this with the right controls in place to be able to manage that? More and more, I'm seeing organizations not only want to be resilient, but they want to be agile, to be able to be prepared for what's coming at them, to either avoid risk events or to minimize those risk events. The third trend is integrity, because the organization pretended as something else. And particularly, we're seeing this in the context of ESG, environmental social governance. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Unfortunately, in the USA, too many people think of ESG as climate change. Climate change is important, but it's only a fraction of the E in ESG. And that's not even the S and the G. Climate change is critically important. I'm not downplaying it. But even in the E, you've got things like PFAS and forever chemicals, and air, water, waste, use of natural resources, pollution. All these elements are part of the E. The E is much bigger than just climate change. And you unpack the S and you get things like child labor, forced labor, working hours, health and safety, privacy is part of the S, inclusivity and diversity. And then you unpack the G and you get internal controls over financial reporting, tax transparency, beneficial ownership, anti-bribery and corruption, fraud, information security. There's a lot in ESG, and we have to address this. And corporate investors like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they're making investment decisions based on organizations' ESG practices. Individual board members are being voted out if they don't hit ESG metrics. Regulators are picking up on that. I'll come back to that in a second, from regulating ESG in different ways. Your employees are making decisions on who they do business with on shared values, not just on salary and benefits. And so are your customers and clients and your business partners. ESG is critically important. And we're seeing a lot of focus on this around the world, but we're seeing a lot, particularly in Europe. The EU CSRD, the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, went into effect this year. And it requires nearly 50,000 firms to start producing ESG reports, including many North American firms that have significant operations in Europe. 50,000 firms have to start ESG reporting now. Now, this gets more complex because the EU Parliament just a few weeks ago passed the EU CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that requires ongoing operational controls and monitoring of ESG within the business, but across third-party relationships, the suppliers, vendors, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, and more. If you think about it, the modern organization is not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. The modern organization is this extended web of third-party relationships. You walk down the halls of many organizations and sit in conference rooms, and half the people you encounter are not employees, but suppliers, vendors, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, and more. And we have to address this ESG across these extended third-party relationships as well. ESG is getting a lot of focus, and organizations need to step up to the game. Integrity is what you communicate to the world that your values are, is the reality in the organization. In fact, just as a case in point, I've got a code of conduct here on my laptop. Back in the year 2000, it was the model code of conduct. Other companies are copying to be their code of conduct. In fact, I had a petroleum company from Canada that told me that they nearly copied that code of conduct word for word to be their code of conduct back in 2000. I'm talking about Enron's code of conduct. That's smoke and mirrors, my friends. We need to make sure that the policies and controls that we communicate are in place around E, S, and G. And I don't think anybody on this call doesn't play somewhere in there, because if you're interacting with solutions like Pathlock, you're definitely focused on the G part of ESG, if not the other aspects. Pathlock and others have a significant place to play in ESG control monitoring as well. Integrity is absolutely crucial there. But then the fourth trend is accountability. Accountability is different from responsibility. Responsibilities I can give to other people. I can pass the responsibilities and tasks off to my friend William that sits in the desk next to me here. And that's giving responsibilities to somebody else. Accountability is something I own. I can't give William accountability. I can only give him responsibilities and tasks because I own accountability. It's something I have to answer for. If William fails to fulfill those tasks, well, I'm the one that is accountable and actually has to suffer the consequences for that. And we're seeing a huge rash of accountability type regulations around the world, like the UK's United Kingdom Senior Managers and Certification Regime, Ireland's SEER Senior Executive Accountability Regime, Australia, what was the BEAR regime, now the FEAR or FAR regime. I think that's the best acronym for regulation ever, is the FEAR regulation, the Financial Executive Accountability Regime. You got Hong Kong's Managers in Charge, Singapore's Individual Accountability and Conduct, and last summer, South Africa passed one as well. Like in the UK, you have to have 28 senior management functions that are ultimately accountable for risk. And in that context, if there's willful misconduct, that senior management function can go to jail. If there's negligence or lack of due diligence, that senior management function can be fined out of their bank account, not the company's bank account. So Barclays' former CEO was fined £640,000 for a whistleblower infraction under UK SMCR. Just a few months ago, a chief information officer, CIO of a bank in the United Kingdom, was fined £81,000. That's nearly what we're at 100,000 US dollars. 81,000 pounds for a third-party risk issue. A CIO was fined 81,000 pounds for a third-party risk issue. The bank had to pay 40 million pounds. The CIO had to pay 80,000 pounds out of his bank account, not the bank's bank account. That's accountability. But you look at the U.S. Department of Justice evaluation compliance programs. You look at the U.S. Sentencing Commission, organizational sentencing practices. You look at the regulators, all putting greater accountability on executives and compliance and control officers in this area. In New York State and California as well, greater liability for compliance on senior executives. And then you have Uber's former chief information security officer who was found personally liable for withholding information on a security breach. Lots and lots of focus on accountability. But then the fifth trend is engagement. We need to be able to engage the organization at all levels, from the board down to operational management to frontline employees. Governance, risk, and compliance doesn't happen in the back office, the second, third lines of risk, compliance, security, and internal control functions. GRC actually happens throughout all layers of the business. And we need good technology and ways to be able to monitor and enforce controls at all levels of the organization and engage all levels of the organization. So to fulfill a good GRC strategy means that we have to have an internal control management strategy that maps to the enterprise view of risks. We have to have strong internal control management processes to be able to manage the complexity of internal controls across business systems and applications, and not just in silos. And then we need to have a strong information technology architecture like our host Pathlock that can deliver and see the intricacies and insights in control and control automation across business systems and processes in today's very complex business environment. And so we need to be able to provide 360-degree contextual intelligence and internal controls so that we can move away from those manual processes of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, oh my, to then also move from siloed business internal control solutions to an integrated view of internal controls across business systems and ERP systems in the environment, something that like our host Pathlock provides today. Now, in areas of GRC technology, I've defined 6 generations of GRC technology out there. Remember, I first defined GRC back in February 2002 on that cold, snowy day in the Chicago office of Forrester. And I had a broad view of GRC then, but what else happened that year? Sarbanes-Oxley. And so GRC 1.0, I call the Sarbanes-Oxley captivity of GRC. because for the first 3 or 4 years of GRC existence, it was all about the internal controls over financial reporting for SOX compliance. Then we entered GRC 2.0, which really was my vision for GRC at the beginning, which was enterprise GRC, bringing an enterprise perspective and collaboration across back office, second and third line functions of risk, compliance, control, and audit. But we focused a lot on GRC applications at that point, GRC platforms. But there isn't one platform that does everything. There's a lot of platforms for workflow and forms and tasks, but they didn't automate controls in the environment. And so more and more, there's different types of systems and technology needed. So we moved into GRC 3.0, what I call GRC architecture. There can still be a core platform to document the risks and controls, but we needed separate types of solutions to be able to automate and manage specific control areas as well as other areas of risk and compliance. But then came a point about 6, 7, 8 years ago where I was getting a lot of complaints that a lot of the legacy solutions that are 20 years old, that they were very costly to implement, maintain. People wanted low code, no code solutions, ones that didn't take, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars to implement and configure. And so this entered the area of GRC 4.0, low code, no code solutions that are highly agile to configure and adapt to the organization. On top of GRC 4.0, we now built GRC 5.0, cognitive GRC, the role of artificial intelligence, things like generative AI with ChatGPT, to natural language processing, to read regulations and identify, categorize and map them and identify and map them to controls in the environment, predictive analytics and machine learning. And we're moving into this era of GRC 6.0, what I call business integrated GRC, where GRC more and more becomes baked into business processes and not these additional layers of complexity and band-aids, where control automation across business systems becomes more and more of a necessity instead of all these isolated islands of controls that don't see the big picture. We're moving towards that era of business integrated governance, risk, and compliance. So organizations need to have an integrated and continuous internal control strategy that delivers the ability to quickly identify control, trends, patterns, and outliers, easily communicate discoveries with stakeholders and engage them, particularly those that are accountable, intuitively follow through with actions that are related to controls and be able to address them. We need to be able to identify those controls and risks across complex and distributed business systems, understand how control issues and failures impact our strategy and delivery on objectives, measure overall control performance, align and work together so that we don't have too many controls, that we can find controls that are effective at meeting a lot of different requirements and needs, and improve and optimize control effectiveness over time. Other benefits that are absolutely critical is getting good visibility that enhances audit accuracy and potentially even reduces audit costs and findings. We have good reliability and resilience that supports the business strategy. Building efficiency where time saved, money saved to reduce manual tasks. So it doesn't take us 200 hours to build that report. It's there at a push of a button. And where 80% of our staff time isn't managing and chasing documents and spreadsheets and emails, it's actually managing risk and controls and improving risk and control. Having the right coverage across business systems, not having isolated views of controls, but having an expansive view of transaction controls and access controls and configuration controls and master data controls across a heterogeneous business environment that might involve SAP and Oracle and Salesforce and NetSuite and so much more. And keeping controls current in the context of all that change. Regulatory change, risk change, business change, employee change, technology change. We need agility to make sure controls are the right controls, accurate for the organization in the context of all this change. This also means we need to be more responsive, be able to drive timely action around controls in the environment. Absolutely critical. We need good accuracy to be able to understand the reliability controls. Accuracy doesn't happen, my friends, in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. We need clear, engaging visibility deep down into the controls and be able to see patterns across business systems as well. But another key element for governance, risk, and compliance and leveraging technology in this space is defensible GRC. Having that single system of truth for internal controls, that system of record, to be able to identify what control was in place on what date and time. Were there exceptions to that control? Were those exceptions properly approved? You know, nothing's worse than when the external auditor or regulator comes in and they find exceptions and you sit there scratching your head and pointing fingers. That's all just warning signs. They're like, go dig deeper. You're going to find more control issues here. But if that auditor or that regulator comes in and sees the exception and says, what about this? You can say, oh yeah, that we know fully about that control exception. Here's the documentation around it. Well, you know, when it was approved, who approved it, why it was approved, any compensating controls are in place. You're going to show that you're on the top of your game at that point. And you need good technology to manage exceptions to controls because they do happen. You have password controls in place. Well, there's certain systems that might not be able to fit that strong password policy with special characters and things. You need a control exception. There might be areas where you have control exceptions and policy exceptions around things like bribery and corruption. And not that you're allowing bribes, you don't want to allow that, but things like gifts, entertainment, hospitality, political contributions. Maybe you have a policy that says you cannot accept a gift of more than $100 of value in the course of 12 months from any specific entity in aggregate. You know, well, maybe there's a good reason to give a gift beyond that limit. Well, if you do, and there is a good reason and it's been approved, it better be documented and the reasons why. You need to document those exceptions when they happen. You need to be able to demonstrate how you met regulatory and compliance requirements, have strong auditable records. My friends, document spreadsheets and emails don't get you this. I can manufacture evidence of controls in document spreadsheets and emails. And the regulators, external auditors, opposing counsel in lawsuits, law enforcement, they're catching up onto this. They want to be able to see that system of record on what was the control in place on what date and time. If somebody came back and modified or manipulated something, who did that, date, time stamp. You can't do that, my friends, in document spreadsheets and emails. You need strong an audit trail and system of record that's only available through good control technology to be able to deliver that in the environment today. And you need to be able to show how you demonstrated the sequence of compliance and control as well. So here's my 5-step plan for building a strong GRC management strategy in your organization. First, you need to understand where are you at today and where do you want to be at tomorrow. You have a current state. We all do. Governance, risk, and compliance, GRC. It doesn't matter if you use the term GRC, ERM, ORM, IRM, ABC, XYZ. Every organization on the planet is doing something for governance, risk, and compliance, no matter what label they put on it. Yeah, I don't think we're going to encounter an organization that says we fail to govern the organization, we can care less about risk, and we ignore regulators and compliance. You know, maybe there's organizations like that, but yeah, it shouldn't be. But the whole point is there's something going on for governance, risk, and compliance in some form or fashion today. What's the current state? It could be a mess of documents, spreadsheets, and emails, ad hoc processes, siloed systems, but you have a current state. So what is that current state today? Then what's your future state for GRC and internal control management 2 years from now? And what's your roadmap and path to get you there? That's the first step. The next step is getting the right team on board and getting them working together. Getting the internal control group, the enterprise and operational risk group, the IT security group, the corporate compliance and ethics group, and others to start working together cohesively on a strategy for internal controls, as well as enterprise risk and GRC in that context, and be able to map that out for you. But the next one's absolutely critically important. You need to have the right equipment for the GRC journey. You don't just throw everything in a bag, and you carefully select your equipment for the task. Now, what happens if you got a very good, strong vision for governance, risk, and compliance in your organization? So you start your journey, you're climbing the mountain, and you find you only have enough equipment to get you halfway up the mountain. Like, let's just use the illustration that maybe you selected something that only does SAP access controls, but you have a heterogeneous environment, and your vision is to have an enterprise view of controls across business systems. Well, that technology that you had that only focuses on an isolated aspect of controls isn't going to get you all the way to the end. You need to make sure that you start with the right equipment. And so if you want an enterprise view of controls across complex and distributed and heterogeneous business systems and things, you need to make sure you have the right technology platform that can deliver on that broad perspective of managing the array of master data record controls to configuration controls to transaction controls to procurement controls to access controls in the environment. And so you want to make sure you have the right technology that can get you down the path on your journey. Now, GRC journeys can be complex and very challenging. So you also have to break things up into stages that are achievable for the organization. And this is absolutely critical and necessary. You don't just run up Mount Everest. What happens when you run up Mount Everest? Well, you die, unless you're Nepali and you're used to that altitude. Your body actually has to acclimate to the altitude at certain levels before it's ready to get to the next level. And same thing with the broad GRC strategy with an enterprise view of controls. We need to start with what's achievable in the first 3 months, and the next 3 months, and the 6 months after that, and break things up into stages. But then you need to be prepared for change. Change happens. Economic uncertainty, geopolitical unrest, wars, pandemics. Who knows? Next year, maybe the Earth will be destroyed by a Vogon constructor ship making way for a hyperspace bypass. For you Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fans. But we don't know what's going to happen. There could be mergers and acquisitions and so much more. You need to be constantly prepared for change in your environment. Another good reason, not only to have a good strategy and team, but good technology they can leverage in the midst of all that change and change in direction and course, and bringing in new systems and through mergers and acquisitions and so forth. You need highly agile technology as well as strategy and process to deliver that and be ready for the change in your environment. So all this means we bring together what I call business integrated GRC, providing 360-degree contextual awareness of governance, risk, and compliance across the business. With business integrated GRC, we can see across systems and processes, we can see across departments and roles and work together. We're more aware of that integrated view of risk. Like the quote I used from Fritjof Capra, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they're interdependent and interconnected. This applies so well to the complexity of controls and risks across different heterogeneous business environments. We need to be able to see the big picture and have greater awareness across this. This allows us to be aligned and work together across different departments and functions, from risk roles to control roles to compliance roles to security roles, and work together and see things. That allows us to be more responsive to changes in the environment and to keep controls consistent and operational in the midst of so much regulatory change, business change, like mergers and acquisitions and employees, as well as risk change. That allows us to be agile to navigate the environment and be prepared for risk and control issues as they develop on the horizon, and we can start seeing these and building out scenarios and how to address them. But the best laid plans of mice and men do fail, and so we need to be resilient to be able to identify control issues and recover from them quickly and get back up and operational. But we want to be able to do all this in a way that leverages information technology to make things more efficient. In time saved and money saved. And so we need to be able to address and do all this and with a measurable impact on the human and financial capital reduction of the organization in this process to be able to do this, to deliver on business integrated GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, GRC 6.0, the future of GRC. So with that, I have a few minutes left here to interact with you on your questions and thoughts to my presentation.
Thank you, Michael. We appreciate your presentation. And again, if you do have any questions, please add them now into the chat box. Our first question is, how do we build a business case?
Well, I get involved in a lot of business case development. And when I do that, I build it around 4 areas. The first one is efficiency. Time saved, money saved. Before it cost us this, it took us 200 hours to build that one report and not even counting all the other reports. Now we spent 80% of our staff time chasing documents, spreadsheets, and emails. Those are all things that we can calculate for the before. And the after, like implementing Pathlock or whatever it might be, how do we reduce that? Well, what's the value that we can show in time saved, money saved, the efficiency? The second element of a business case is effectiveness, which is actually a risk assessment itself. We have our inherent risk before Pathlock. We implement Pathlock, there should be a residual risk because Pathlock or whoever it might be is going to make sure that there's greater control monitoring, more control, monitoring, and getting and automation getting done, less things slipping through cracks, single source of truth and system of record. All that is a measurable risk reduction. So first one was efficiency, second one is effectiveness. The third one is resilience. How quickly, with the right technology, can we find control issues and contain them before they become bigger issues and have a big price tag of an incident attached to them? And then the fourth element of a business case is the agility. How can implementing something like Pathlock make us more agile and keep up with business change in the environment, and to make sure that controls are always operational in the context of a very dynamic and intricate, chaotically changing business environment?
Great. Our next question is advocacy also failing us?
Is advocacy also failing us? I'd have to understand a little bit of that question, but I mean, advocacy being legal advocacy, or advocacy getting the right champions on board internally to address this? Because advocacy has different meanings, and it's quite a complex word. But I would assume that's probably more in the business champion area. Do we have the right business champions to lead this project and things? That's a clear one that a lot of times it can fail, because to have an enterprise view of controls means getting a lot of different departments together. And so you need an advocate, a business champion that can actually speak across different departments and get different teams to work together. Too often we get a champion that has a sort of myopic view and doesn't see the control needs of the other departments and functions.
The next question we have is, could you please summarize your view on the difference between operational resilience and business continuation?
Business continuity.
Continuity.
Yeah, I mean, for some perspectives, operational resilience is the new generation of business continuity, but it's almost a complete rewrite of business continuity. Business continuity, disaster recovery is often buried in the bowels of IT, deep in the organization. Not always, but a lot of times. Resilience is a part of risk management. Like the United States OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, states in their operational resilience guidance that operational resilience is an effective outcome of operational risk management. I've been saying this for nearly 20 years. I understand we have a risk function over here and continuity functions buried down over here, and they never talk to each other. They belong together. They work together. And we need to be more and more resilient. And we're seeing this come to play, like in the United Kingdom, with what we call UK SOX in the UK's corporate governance code. You know, they're actually requiring that the board make resilience statements, you know, on the capability of the organization to be resilient. We're seeing a lot of focus on resilience. And the big thing that makes resilience different from business continuity is that resilience becomes an integrated part of enterprise and operational risk, not a disconnected part.
Great. Our next question is, how do we build support for GRC strategies across the organization?
You need to have a clear and compelling business case. And I already mentioned those four elements of that business case of efficiency and effectiveness, resilience, and agility. That business case. But the thing is there's a lot of different departments, a lot of different needs. So it's getting the right champion on board. And that right champion needs to have a good connection to the C-suite and executives to get overall sponsorship there. But that executive, that champion, also needs to be able to communicate across departments and functions. So when it comes to internal controls, that champion understands financial controls, IT controls, health and safety controls, environmental controls, quality controls, HR controls, and well, the executives need to understand all the intricacies of all that, but can fairly represent and make sure all these different departments and functions can cooperate together in getting them on board with a cohesive strategy. Too often our champions or advocates fail us because they come in there with a myopic view and fail to be able to address the needs of all these other departments and functions for internal controls.
Okay, perfect. That's all the time we have for questions today, and we really appreciate everybody's thoughtful questions and your answers, Michael. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you to all the attendees, and we hope to see you next time.